So tell me, darling, why are we like this? I must admit.
Okay then everybody, welcome back. Thank you for coming back on time. Very pleased to introduce the next person I know very well. I've known him since about 2012, I think, when we first met in London in a pub somewhere when he came over with his colleagues. A little bit more facial hair now as you go a bit older, looking a bit more dapper. Very pleased to introduce a senior consultant from Hogan Assessment Systems, Dr. Darin Nye. Darin has been supporting Mentis as our main contact from Hogan for the last 5 years or so. Darin looks after and works very closely with quite a few of the international consulting partners that Hogan have. An enviable task. I'm trying to keep all of us under control. Darin is also one of Hogan's master trainers in level 1, level 2, does a lot of their training in the US, and again, ensures that all the training is at standard across the world, won't we? So without further ado, I'm very pleased to introduce you to Dr. Darin Nye.
Hi everyone, good afternoon. Thanks for sticking around, and I'd like to thank Mentis for putting on such a great event, and it's truly a pleasure to share the stage, or the floor as it were, with these great speakers. So hopefully you've all found this engaging and interesting, and you've learned something. I'm going to talk today a little bit about succession planning and high potential identification and development. But before I do that, just to share a little background about myself and where I got interested in the concept of talent identification and development, it was from a unique place. So it was the September 11th attacks where I actually got my interest in this. So I was working for the US Department of Defense, and I was trying to understand how terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda attract, select, promote, and retain talent. So even though terrible organizations like that exist, they still are interested in understanding talent. So now I'm doing something a bit different. And the reason I'm doing something different is about my values. Values are very important to all of us, and they're the reason why we find satisfaction in the work we do. My values, a little bit about them. I score a 1 on our tradition scale, and if you know anything about working in the federal government, it's high tradition. I'm also a 93 on hedonism, and if you know anything about the federal government, it's not about hedonism. So every day going into work, while the work was very interesting, I hated it. So now I do something that I'm really passionate about and like. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about high potential identification and introduce our high potential model. So to get started, let's talk a little bit about the barometer with regards to CEOs and organizations. And as you can see up here behind me, the trend has been in more recent years to bring in people from the outside. So back in the 70s, we were bringing a lot of people up in the organization and promoting them into the ranks of the directors and vice presidents and eventually to the C-suite. Now we see that that number has increased substantially. And at the same time, we're seeing the failure rate go up as well. So we're bringing in more CEOs from the outside, but we're not seeing them succeed. And why is that? Well, I think it has a lot to do with the expectations of a leader. One of the key concepts with leaders is that we expect them to be competent. So bringing someone in from the outside, we have to question their competence in that industry and oftentimes within that organization. There's a lot that takes place behind the scenes, and a culture of an organization slowly indoctrinates people over time. And if you're not in that organization from the start, you kind of are an outsider, and you have a countercurrent that you have to battle against. So this could be the reason why we might be going with more externals these days. It could be due to poor pipeline preparation, which I think is a cop-out, and blaming HR for not preparing the organization to have a succession plan. But I think it has more to do with this growth paradox. Organizations tend to be too busy in the here and now growing, and they're not thinking downstream. They're not thinking ahead enough. And so it's not because we're lazy as HR people or we're ill-informed. It's just that we're too busy focused on the mission at hand today, and we haven't had enough time to pause and look into the future. So just a show of hands, a little crowd interaction. Who here in their organization has a succession plan? Great, I have a job still. Now, of those 5 people, how many of you have a successful succession plan in place? One that you're proud of? Okay, good, no one. I really do have a job. Fantastic. So what I want to do is I like to start out this cartoon from the New Yorker. And here, let me set the stage for you. We have maybe the chief HR officer here interviewing a candidate. Meanwhile, the board is running off the previous CEO, and the question being asked, how soon can you start? We don't have the luxury all the time to necessarily pick and choose who we want to promote to these high levels in the organization. Sometimes it's a matter of who's available, and we just have to go with them. And also, we're not addressing the problem, right? I just need someone in the seat because the other person isn't working out, and not even thinking about the underlying root cause of what's going on. So if you ask people in your organization what is a high potential, they'll have a difficult time defining it, but they'll say one thing for sure, that they know it when they see it. And what does that tell me about who's filling the pipeline? Well, it's people that are really good at playing the political game. They have fantastic social skill, they're charismatic, so they're interesting. All of those factors have to do with what we'll call emergence. It's getting noticed, standing out from the crowd, drawing attention to yourself. That's important because you need to be noticed in order to be put in these places, but that's only part of the equation. What we should really be focusing in on is this concept about effectiveness. What do people need to be doing? What do we expect of them? And what are the characteristics that are going to help them succeed? Not just get noticed, but actually be effective when we promote him or her up to the next level. So the road to identifying high potentials is paved with good intentions. It's not that boards are malicious. They may be arrogant, but they're not malicious. They're not out there trying to put people in positions of power that are going to harm the organization. It's just they're really not thinking about the full picture. Oftentimes, one of the key indicators, if you ask people in organizations, who should we start looking at in terms of our high potential pool, they'll just look at performance metrics. They'll go straight to the performance metrics and look at the highest performers and say, those are the people that we should be considering for the next level of management or leadership. But we know that that's problematic. So I like to use analogies, and I think about sports analogies in this situation. When you have a great footballer or a great rugby player or a great volleyball player, they're fantastic in the role that they occupy and in the job that they perform. Now take him or her off the court or off the pitch and put them on the sidelines. Take them out of that element where they are performing well and put them somewhere else. I mean, that's essentially what we're doing in our organizations. Find the highest performer and promote them out of their job. Put them somewhere else, which is very counterintuitive. Because what we know is the performance expectations change when we move people in different roles. So we shouldn't necessarily just be looking at past performance. We should be thinking about future expectations. The models that organizations create, the competency models, the leadership models, they're often designed by committee. And what do we know about the committees? That's how we get the camel, right? It's a horse designed by committee. So you have people with their own individual viewpoints about what the organization should be doing and the characteristics of the people that we should put in place and the key performance indicators. And you have these competing forces that take place at the board level. And often there's a lot of compromise that takes place there. And that's one of the challenges we face as well. Obviously, there's a lot of politics involved here, and we're focusing in on my recommendation of the next person to succeed as leader in this organization. I want that person to reflect well on me as an individual. And so if I think I'm a good performer, then I'm going to try and identify someone who's very similar to me. Maybe went to the same university as I did, was in the same fraternity as I was, grew up in the same neighborhood that I came from. And then lastly, we're not focusing in on the hidden potential. We're only focusing in on the surface level characteristics, the thing that draws us to that person initially. So here's where I give my word of caution to all of you in the room. It's that it's dangerous to be right in matters on which the established authorities are wrong. So in this situation, the established authority is the organization that you report to, and you have a reputation at stake. And you're trying to influence the organization, and most of the time, you're right, but the organization may be wrong. So it can be very risky to try and influence and change a high potential program radically. So what I'm going to argue for is a subtle change. I'm not necessarily interested in convincing my organization that they need to change how they're identifying high potentials. I'll concede that fact. I'll let them say, no, whoever you put up, we'll call them your high potentials. What I want to do is, now that they're in that spot, now that they've been identified, I want to work with them to say, where do they need to develop? So it's a little bit of a safer play in order to influence the succession plans that your organizations have or are developing without risking everything. So I'm going to argue for two things. First, you need to take a future-oriented recruitment strategy, which is to think about where your organization is going to go in the future. You need to understand not necessarily where you are today, but also where you want to go. But then also thinking about how you can tie this into a development program as well. So it's twofold. It's understanding the characteristics you need to identify in people in the future, and then working on developing those people within your organization now to be able to step into that role in the future. So when we think about this, you need to understand your organization and the industry that you're in, and what you want to do as an organization given your industry. Are you an established player in the market, or are you new to the market and maybe you need to play some catch up? Are you in an industry that's susceptible to disruption, or are you in a stable industry? Do you want to be one of the first disruptors in your industry as well? We know that some of the first entrants into a market are not necessarily the ones that stick around at the end. So the first cell phone maker is not around anymore. Apple wasn't the first one to develop the iPad, but now they're obviously the most successful as it comes to tablets. So understand where you are in the industry that you're in. You also need to think about internally what's worked out well before, and start to benchmark who's been successful and why, what characteristics do they share in common, but more importantly, what differentiates that group of people from the low performers. So there might be a characteristic that high performers share in common, and we may be drawn to that initially. But if we don't know if that characteristic is shared with the low performers, we may be latching on to a characteristic that actually doesn't differentiate performance whatsoever. So I want to look at who's doing well, who's succeeded in the past and why, and who's failed and why, and understand what are the things that differentiate those two groups. So I'm going to argue for a data-driven assessment model. So I'm from Hogan. I believe in personality, but I don't think it's the silver bullet. It's not the end-all, be-all. It's, as we heard earlier, it's a piece in the jigsaw puzzle that helps us bring this together. But organizations do a terrible job of using data in their identification and promotion process. It tends to be subjective ratings for the most part of how people get promoted. So I'm trying to encourage you all to introduce some objectivity into the process. Think about comprehensive evaluation, multiple sets of predictors. You also need to understand that there's going to be a moving target, that what you think is needed for success today and how you measure success today is going to change over time. And you better be ready to adapt your programs to meet those changes. And then lastly, there's going to be more than one set of criteria. It's not just about supervisor ratings. You also want to think about peer ratings. You want to think about direct report ratings from first-line managers. You want to think about customer ratings as well. Get outside your organization to understand all the different ways performance can be categorized and measured. So again, I'm not trying to go out into the organization and be a radical cowboy and try and shake it up because that's dangerous, right? Let's concede that the high potentials that have been put forth are in fact the right ones. What I'm arguing for is now we need to work on developing them. So the next question is, so what? What do we do? Well, this is where I'm going to introduce my model. And like any good model, it has 3 components. So the fun part about this model is this isn't just something that we sat around a table and dreamed up one day while we were sitting at the bar. We went and looked at the literature to understand what are the commonalities in high potential models. We started going to organizations that we work with to understand the organizations that do it well. What are the commonalities that they have? And we started piecing this together to provide a model that should be predictive, that should demonstrate some ROI. This model is nice because it prioritizes things within you as an individual, but it also gives you a reference to other people as well. So there's 2 comparisons or 2 benchmarks that we're making within this. And one thing that's nice about it is it's quite humbling. The brightest shining star is going to have areas that they need to develop. The worst performer on this is going to have areas that they look good at. There's going to be some positive elements in this model as well. So it takes people who are riding high and have been identified as a hypo and introduces an element of modesty or humility into it. But then those people who don't score so well, we're going to do some things to uplift those people as well. So I'm going to go through the 3 components. And when I was hearing the first presentation from Minor, I was really interested in seeing that they have a very ambitious plan, right? We saw how many people they want to add, how many new hotels they want to build. And in order to build a successful hotel, I want you to think about that as I step through this model. It's like building a building. If you're going to build a beautiful property, what's the first thing you need to do? You need to make sure that building has a strong foundation. If your building doesn't have a strong foundation, it's not likely going to be able to stand the test of time. So just like buildings need to have a good foundation, your high potentials need to have a good foundation. And when I'm talking about a good foundation, I'm talking about being able to manage your own career, to be rewarding to deal with, and to be a good organizational citizen. Someone who's able to play within the rules. Because the people that are going to be most successful understand that disruption should take place at an incremental pace. They need to understand the history and tradition of the organization to understand what is good about it, what they should retain, and what things need to alter and change in order for us to be successful. So the 3 competencies that I have here are following process. So those are the people who play by the rules. They understand what they're being evaluated against and what behaviors are rewarded and what behaviors are punished, and they understand how to navigate that framework. Second component, people who think broadly. So they're not just concerned about the job that they're doing in front of them, they're thinking about how it impacts other people as well. So they're able to connect the dots across the work that they're doing. Lastly, they need to be good at getting along. These are the people that are good team players. They're able to work with other people. So those are the 3 core components that lend itself to having a strong foundation. And why does it matter? Well, when we think about how people interview, they tend to be playing a role. It's very structured. So if I'm meeting with my boss, I'm going to say all the things that I want him or her to hear. They may not be true, but I'm going to fake it, right? And so people who do well in these employment interviews may be a shining star on the surface, but behind the scenes, we actually see something different. Once they get in the role, it's not necessarily the person I interviewed, it's something else. So they might be lazy and distracted. They might be self-centered, unpleasant to deal with. They don't want to work as part of a team. They're just interested in doing things that will help their own agenda. And lastly, they may be unreliable. So these things aren't going to come up in an interview. So we're not able to assess a foundation effectively if we're just focusing on that. We need objective data. So great, I've built a strong foundation. Now, what's going to get people interested in coming to my property? Well, it needs to look nice. It needs to stand out from the other properties. And that's what leadership emergence is about. And that's probably what most of your organization's high potential programs are filled with. People who are able to emerge and stand out from the crowd. People who are good at this concept of leadership emergence are able to get noticed, they're able to influence other people, and they do that by building a network. So the three factors that underlie that: first, standing out. They're able to call attention to themselves and distance themselves from their peers so they get noticed. They build connections, strategic connections. They don't spend their time on people that aren't going to serve their agenda. They're going to figure out who they need to kiss up to, who they need to build alliances with, and they'll work on those relationships. Lastly, now that they have the right connections, they have to be able to influence them. Say, hey, listen to me. I know what I'm talking about. I can help this organization. You're going to want to put all your investment in me. And why does this stuff matter? Again, it's about being noticed in order to be put in a spot in order to be effective. If you're flying under the radar, you're never going to get noticed by your boss. You may have all the potential in the world, but if you're not doing enough to call attention to yourselves, you're not doing yourself a service. You're going to get passed over. So being visible, it's important to gain access to resources. You know, the old saying, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. That's what I'm talking about here. And those relationships are important. That's how you're able to develop the networks that you need to get put in the right places. Great, so I've got a strong foundation. I've got a building that's attractive, it's standing out from the rest of it. But what's most important, what's going to keep guests coming back to your property? That the inside looks nice. It's effective, it does its job. So you have to have a strong foundation, you have to be able to stand out, but then you have to be effective once you're put in that spot. So when I think about effectiveness and I think about leadership, my definition of leadership, Hogan's definition of leadership, is someone who's able to bring together a team of individuals that can set aside their individual aspirations and agendas and focus on the team mission and really come together and work to be able to outperform the competition and to be able to maintain that over time. So the three factors associated with that are leading people. So it's about getting other people to follow what you want to do, to get them to set aside their own ambitions and work towards the collective goal. They need to think about the critical business outcomes and understand when they need to cut bait and move away from one thing and go to something else because it's more critical to the mission at hand. And then they need to be able to manage resources effectively. So whether that's people resources, time resources, whatever capital we're working with. Those are the important factors when it comes to effectiveness. And why does it matter? That's the reason we're here, right? We're trying to put human resources in a position that are able to accomplish our goal with the least amount of resistance. We want people that spend the least amount of resources on developing and managing and put them in places where they can be effective and achieve critical business outcomes. So here is the model, and I bet most of your organizations have a lot of these people, politicians, so they're really good at emerging and drawing attention to themselves, but they're not necessarily effective. This bottom quadrant, if you have unlimited resources, you might want to spend your time there, but as we know, change is difficult, and so it's going to take a lot more time for those individuals to both stand out and be effective in the role. What we want to focus on is more on this right-hand side. We're focusing on people who have low emergence but high effectiveness, and how can we dig out those hidden gems, those people that have hidden potential. And hopefully we can find a bunch of these, the true hypos, those people who stand out but can also deliver once we put them into that spot. So how do we go about measuring this model? Well, I'm going to use my 3 core inventories. As I mentioned at my intro, we're going to start here with this MVPI thing. What is it that you want to do? What motivates you? What are you interested in? Those are the things that we want to focus on to say, do you want to do the job? In my example, I didn't want to do the job. I didn't want to work in that environment. So it didn't matter how many resources you dumped into me. I wasn't going to pan out to be a high potential in that organization. Then I'm going to move over here and I'm going to focus on the HPI, the bright side of personality. That tells me, do you have the right characteristics needed and able to perform that job? So I'm going to take you from your individual contributor role and I'm going to promote you out of it into a leadership position. Well, do you have the right characteristics that tell me you can lead? And then lastly, I'm going to focus on this thing, the HDS, and says, great, you want to do it, you can do it, but what's going to stand in your way? And we all have derailers. We all have things that are going to stand in our way. And it's just a matter of understanding, are those derailers going to impede our performance given the context that we're in? So not all derailers are created equal. Certain derailers are going to be more harmful in certain situations than others. So you really have to do your job of understanding the context to be able to identify the key derailers going on here. So it takes all three of those assessments in order for me to get a full picture of who you are. And if I'm missing any one of them, I'm just going to be left to assume. So that's why we want to bring all three components in. So we're going to help you build a strong foundation. We're going to identify the strengths, but we're also going to focus on those developmental opportunities. Because you can play to your strengths if you want, but are you really going to improve? You got to focus on the things you don't do well if you want to improve. As Dr. Hogan would say, there's no news in good news. So that's why we're going to focus on developmental opportunities. And this is where the report adds the element of humility. And I think a lot of high potentials, especially if you're actually identifying them and telling them they're high potential, they're going to need a dose of humility. Our model focuses on universal facets of leadership. So this is something that can be deployed across multiple levels and across multiple organizations and across many industries. It was not something that was built just for one particular instance. It's more well-rounded. And it provides that holistic approach because, again, I'm pulling in all of the elements in terms of motivators, bright side and dark side characteristics. So yeah, again, it's going to motivate people that they constantly have to be working to improve, to do things in order to better themselves, that everyone has strengths and areas of developmental opportunities. So here's the report. We can provide some samples. They're on the Mentis website as well if you're interested, and they're in their brochures in the back of the room. But it's a very comprehensive, developmentally oriented report. So this can be deployed right off the shelf to be used with your already identified high potentials to start working on how they can develop over time. So this over here is just going to provide a basic summary of what we see in the report, where I see my three core areas, the competencies that underlie each, and what highs and lows look like. I'm also going to show this nice executive summary page, which can be it can be used as a standalone. And I want to draw your attention to a couple of things. First, you notice there's this color scheme going on here. And this is the benchmark against the population. So it shows your scores compared to the reference group to understand how do you stack up to other people. And then what we do down here is we rank it within the individual. So you can prioritize areas of strength and opportunity within this individual. And that's where I'm introducing the element of humility. Even the best shining stars on this model are going to have things that show up in the low quadrant here. And it's going to say these are the three areas you're going to want to focus on if you want to be effective. And then here are your strengths over here. Maybe you ignore those for a little bit because you're doing them well. They're kind of automatic. But it's these things that you need to really work on because it doesn't come naturally to you at all. And then through the rest of the report, we break it down. We provide the HPI, the HDS, the MVPI scale that's tied to each competency. So those of you who are Hogan certified and very familiar with the scales, you'll recognize those things. And that's where you can really jump into using this in a developmental feedback situation. So those scores right there, those are normative scores. Tells you where you rank in the population. And then we got stop, start, keeps. So the traditional method of developing things. What do you do well? What are you not doing so well? What do you need to add to the arsenal? And we go through and we do that for each of the 9 competencies. So it's a dense report. It's got like 9-point font. There's so much text in there. But it's really what you need to enable to develop your high potentials. It's going to give you everything that you need. So how do you blend this into existing high potential systems? Well, it can help with identification. I cautioned you against doing that because it's risky, but you could use it to start to nominate people based on what competencies are most important. You can start ranking your candidates on those factors. You can connect it with your own competencies as well. So organizations, they love their competency models and they get really attached to them and they want things in their language. Well, we'll help you in order to map our model back to your model so you have a nice crosswalk between the two. This is going to provide you an objective viewpoint on these individuals' reputation in the organization, how other people see them, which, again, I'm not necessarily going to show that in an interview. I'm going to give you my best foot forward. This gives a more objective view. You can use this as a starting point to conduct an interview with someone, to probe further around areas of weakness, hone in on those particular scales that are drawing that competency down, and understand what's going on behind the scenes, how it's playing out for the individual, and start working on areas of development. You can look at your cohort. You can look at everyone in your high potential program as a group to understand if we are continuing to put people into our high potential program, what are we going to continue to get? And what are we going to miss out on that we might think about changing the way we identify high potentials? And then obviously it's really well suited for individual development planning. Has a common framework that you can use across all your high potentials to guide your high potential development programs. So it's a really nice universal framework. And then you can conduct some group workshops as well. And the nice thing is you don't have to necessarily start out from scratch. We've developed a set of core materials that you can use and adapt to bring into your developmental programs. And this can help the learning process among your high potentials, bringing them all together in a group, pointing out the characteristics that are important within that organization, and getting other people to start holding each other accountable, to identify some shared weaknesses or shared blind spots that this group may have, and start prioritizing areas of development. So you can really link this back into the organizational objectives and goals and get the team working together. And as I said, we have these developmental resources that are already built for you that you don't have to worry about creating your own necessarily. You just have to worry about modifying them to fit within your organization. So the career development workshop that's scalable for groups. We have the facilitator guide and training, so talk to the folks at Mentis about how you can get hooked up with this. We've created a behavioral interview guide that can go along with this. That's really nice to be able to use the assessment and report as a standalone, but then later on come in and use this interview guide to help dig further to understand what are some of the underlying root causes here, or what's really going on behind the scenes. And then all this information can be combined together and provide an executive summary back to the stakeholders to say, why are we investing? What are we getting back in return? But it's also a helpful diagnostic tool to figure out what are the things that we need to add to our high potential identification process? Where are the weak spots right now? What does that mean for our mission and where we want to be in the next 5 to 10 years? And you can really start to have a meaningful conversation about that stuff. So it's been a busy day. There's been a lot of stuff thrown at you. I know it's later in the day. And so if you haven't paid attention to anything, I don't blame you. It's okay. Just pay attention to these 3 bullets. That's what I want you to take home. First is that good succession planning should have 2 components. So it's focus on the future-oriented recruitment strategy, but also think about development. Identifying high potentials is step 1. What you do from there is really what's going to separate you from your competition, and it's developing those individuals to say it's a long road to be successful. Second, Recruit for the future. Use evidence, use data. Understand that subjectivity will always be a component, but we can supplement that by having some objectivity as well. And that helps challenge people's assumptions or why they made certain recommendations. If they make a good recommendation, they have the data to back it up, then perfect. If they make a recommendation, they come up stinky on this report, well, now we want to dig into it and figure out what's going on. What did you see in this individual that's not showing up on the report? And then lastly, there's 3 components that you want to think about. It's the strong foundation as a leader, it's the ability to emerge, but it's also the ability to be effective once you're put in that role. So with that, I thank you, and I'll open it up to any questions.
Okay.
Saving them for the panel. Okay. Cool.
Right. Thank you very much, Darin. Much appreciated. Now I'm going to move straight in the interest of time, to the discussion panel. So we'll squeeze out. So if I could ask our panelists to come up to the seats, we'll jump straight in, and we'll try and make sure we finish reasonably on time. Yes, you are, Lewis. Thank you.